He thought his father had outlived his usefulness. What happened next will shock you. The soft tapping sound came from inside the wooden box, so faint it could have been imagined. But there it was again, steady, deliberate. Kofi's hands froze on the ropes as he stood at the cliff's edge, his breath catching in his throat. He wasn't sure whether to open the lid or let the silence of the night swallow the sound. The wind howled around him, tugging at his clothes, urging him forward. But the tapping, that light tapping, kept him rooted in place. His heart pounded, the weight of his decision heavier than the wooden box at his feet. What had he done? Chapter 1. The Old Man's Silence. Once upon a time, a humble farmer named Kofi lived in an African village nestled at the foot of rolling green hills. For years, Kofi had worked tirelessly alongside his father, Badu. Their farm thrived with yams, millet, and maize, feeding their family and the entire village. The old man had taught Kofi everything he knew about the land: how to read the weather, coax the earth into yielding its bounty, and endure even the harshest seasons. But as the seasons passed, so did Badu's strength. His once strong back had become bent, and his hands, once capable of turning the soil, had grown too weak to hold a hoe. Kofi now ran the farm by himself, while Badu sat on the porch day after day, staring at the fields he could no longer tend. His silence was constant, and to Kofi, it felt like a weight that grew heavier each day. "Why does he just sit there doing nothing?" Kofi muttered to himself. "He's of no use anymore." The frustration gnawed at him, slowly transforming into bitterness. Every time he glanced at his father sitting there so peacefully, it only reminded him of the extra work he had to do on the farm. It felt unfair. And so, Kofi's mind, clouded by exhaustion and resentment, hatched a plan, one that made his heart race, but seemed to promise an end to his burdens. Chapter 2. A Plan in the Shadows. One evening, after the sun had dipped beneath the horizon and the village had settled into a quiet lull, Kofi set to work. He gathered some wood, the finest he could find, and began building a coffin. His hands worked quickly, driven by frustration more than care. As he hammered the nails into place, his mind swirled with thoughts. "He is just a burden now," he told himself repeatedly, trying to justify what he was about to do. The stars blinked down from the sky as Kofi dragged the coffin to the porch where his father sat. Badu, calm and unreadable, looked up but said nothing. Kofi could not meet his eyes. "Father," Kofi began, his voice tight, "it is time." Badu stood, his frail body moving without resistance, and climbed into the coffin without a word. The sight sent a chill through Kofi, but he steeled himself, forcing his thoughts to stay on the task. He closed the lid and began dragging the coffin toward the cliff at the edge of their farm, where the land dropped away into a deep, misty abyss. Chapter 3. The Cliff's Edge. As Kofi approached the cliff, the sound of the wind whistling through the trees mingled with the creaking of the coffin. His heart thumped louder with each step. This was the moment. His burden would be gone, and the farm would be his alone. No more silent, watchful eyes judging his every move. But just as he reached the precipice, that faint tapping began. Kofi stopped, frozen. The sound was soft, yet it cut through the wind like a knife. He hesitated before opening the lid. His father lay there, not accusing, not angry, just calm. "Yep, I know you are going to throw me over the cliff," Badu said again. "But before you do, remember, your children may one day do the same to you." The words hit Kofi like a spear to the chest. His hands trembled as he stared at the man who had raised him, who had taught him everything, who had grown old under the same sun that now beat down on him. The mist swirling at the cliff's edge seemed to rise, swallowing his thoughts in a haze of shame and regret. Chapter 4. A Moment of Realization. Kofi staggered back from the coffin, the weight of his father's words settling heavily on his shoulders. The truth was undeniable. His father was not a burden, but a man who had given his whole life to ensure that Kofi had a future. Badu's silence had not been judgment but wisdom. The old man knew that Kofi would face this moment one day. Tears welled in Kofi's eyes as he realized what he had almost done. He looked at his father again, lying there in the coffin, and saw not an old man who had outlived his usefulness, but a father who had given him everything. Thank you for following the story up to this point. Please subscribe. Chapter 5. The Return. Without a word, Kofi pulled the coffin away from the cliff. He did not stop until he was back at their home, the sound of the village night buzzing around him. Gently, he opened the lid again, helping his father sit up. "I'm sorry, father," Kofi whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what came over me." Badu smiled, his eyes soft and understanding. "It is the way of the world, my son. When we grow old, the young often forget the sacrifices made before them. But now you see, and that is all that matters." The next day, the two of them sat together on the porch, Badu's presence no longer a burden, but a reminder of the cycle of life. Kofi worked in the fields as he always had, but now he glances up at his father with gratitude, not frustration. He understood that while the old man's hands were no longer strong enough for the farm, his wisdom and presence were more valuable than Kofi had ever realized. Chapter 6. A Lesson for the Village. Word of what had happened spread through the village, as stories often did in those parts. Kofi had been prepared to throw his father away to rid himself of what he saw as a useless old man. But he had learned just in time the importance of family, respect, and the wisdom of the elders. One evening, the village elder, Kwame, called a gathering under the large baobab tree that stood at the center of the village. He raised his staff and spoke to the people about Kofi's story. "Let this be a lesson for us all," Kwame said, his voice carrying through the crowd. "Our elders are not burdens to be cast away when they grow old. They are the roots that hold us steady, the memory of the land, the keepers of wisdom. Without them, we are like trees without roots, easily toppled by the winds of time." The villagers nodded in agreement, and from that day onward, they treated their elders with renewed respect and care. The lesson had taken root just as surely as the crops in Kofi's field. Chapter 7. The Harvest of Wisdom. Seasons passed and Kofi's farm flourished. The fields were rich with yams and maize, and Kofi's heart was grateful. He had not only learned to value the wisdom of the elders, but he had also become a better father. He taught his children not only how to work the land, but also how to respect those who had come before them. Badu lived out his days in peace, surrounded by his family. His legacy was not one of toil in the fields, but of love, wisdom, and the quiet strength that had always been his greatest gift. When Kofi's time finally came, his children remembered the story he had once told them, the story of the coffin, the cliff, and the lesson of the elders. They held him with love, knowing that the cycle of life continues, but the roots of wisdom never wither. Moral of the story: respect for the elders and the wisdom of those who have come before us is a treasure that cannot be measured in work or toil. In the end, it is the guidance and knowledge passed down through the generations that sustains a family and a community. Thank you for following the story until the end. Please subscribe for more.